3, or module number 3. Now, today we are going to go over how to fear less and forgive in the office. And this is huge for your emotional intelligence practice and developing your emotional grit. So the last 2 modules, we focused in on you and how you and your leadership could make things so much better for your bottom line, in attracting the right patients, in getting rid of the patients that you don't really want to see. But it really all depends on your mindset and if you're open to that. Okay, and there's a couple of different schools of thought. However, your key takeaways this week is really to have courage. This is your key characteristic. Key characteristic, try to say that 3 times. But your key characteristic is courage. So the courage to act with authenticity in your practice. The courage to forgive. The courage to fear less or fear less. And one of the big takeaways this week is identifying the fears that you may have in the practice, the fears that you may have around you as a leader, maybe you as a dentist, maybe you and your family. And I encourage you to find out the fears of your patients. So if you are doing this weekly, then every day this week, I encourage you, along with your team, to select one patient or maybe report on one patient that you've identified their biggest fear. And whatever that fear looks like. There's no right or wrong answer, but really just to practice this, because it's a very important concept. And it could be revolutionary to shifting the way you operate in your practice. Now, lastly, when we have things that can happen in the office, we have our stories with our patients, we have the cancellations, we have people that don't show up, your team members canceling on you or maybe even quitting on you, we have embezzlement, we have all of these fears, okay? And I think I shared with you some of my biggest fears and how I used to lead in the past. Now, one of the biggest fears that we're going to talk about and your biggest takeaway is how do you handle the negativity in the office? How do you handle the negativity among the team members, maybe among the doctors if your practice is a larger practice? So we're going to navigate all of these different pieces. But one of the things that I wanted to start talking about for you today is, well, what are some of those fears? And how has some of those fears affected you in being able to lead? And now some of those fears could essentially be being able to communicate properly with patients. And I think one of the biggest things that I could share, even in implementing this with a ton of different doctors and dentists, is the fear of telling the patients the truth. And for those of you who know and experience this, well, for instance, you know that tooth number 5 is on the verge of falling out. Patient is about 70 years old. They want to keep that, but you know that could potentially crack. Okay, and so we're not going to get into the diagnostics of what can happen, but knowing that this type of patient can come into your practice. Now, you and I both know that the easiest solution would be removing this tooth that's probably got a class 2 mobility and put in an implant. Now, patient has probably lost a couple of other teeth and is very jaded, wants to keep this tooth, but you know that this tooth is holding that partial in place. And what happens? And we've all had this happen before in our practice. And before, I would be so afraid of telling that patient the actual truth, what they actually should get, for fear of what they were going to say. Maybe they weren't going to believe me. Maybe they were going to go somewhere else. Perhaps they were not going to come back, whatever the scenario is. And so sometimes we give them not the best solution, but the solution that we think that they should have. Okay? Hopefully you understand. Now, what does this do? This doesn't allow us to be authentic. We are leading our lives based on fear. And so what I'm encouraging you is to put those fears aside. So if one of those fears is the idea that the patient will say no, well, the onus is on them and not you. And so the goal would be, when you're teaching your financial coordinators, your treatment planners, how to propose treatment, even if it may look like a lot, you're giving and you're putting your best foot forward. And now, I'm not going to get into the whole treatment planning agenda on how this could work. What I'm really fascinated about and what I'm focused on teaching you is the why, okay? And why you have this particular fear and how to actually overcome this. So if we're thinking about it from your duty is to make sure you're providing all of the solutions. Whether or not it's a Band-Aid that's getting ripped off, that is your duty. So one take on this would be, Mrs. Wilson, problem, consequence, solution. This tooth is on the verge of coming out. I know you don't want to hear this. I totally understand where you're coming from. I empathize with where you are at, but you are using courage to tell her X, Y, and Z. You're using courage to tell her, well, if we take this out and it's this partial that we just did for you, I understand that we'll probably need to create a new partial or a new solution, but one of the solutions could be a new denture, et cetera, et cetera. So you go down the list, right? Well, what are some of the other big fears? Okay, if we have a cancerous patient in the practice that is very much, that threatens you, that threatens to put a negative review on Yelp or wherever, but is really taking advantage not just of your time, but also your team's time. When are you ready to fire that patient? And why are you keeping that patient in the practice? Do you follow? Now, these are essential steps to understand, okay, why are we having all these fears, and what is the worst that can happen if we tell the truth? If we say, you know what, you canceled the last 3 times, I'm sorry, our practice, these are our rules of the practice, and we can no longer see you. Here are recommendations of 3 other dentists that could gladly take you, okay? Because is that really worth your time? Is that really worth your emotional psychology? Is that really worth your energy? Is it really worth the energy of your team? And so, and lastly, the biggest fear that we constantly get is fear of breaking a file in a patient's mouth, having an implant go bad, or failing during surgery, or some big mishap and it's 6 p.m. and what are you going to tell the patient that you were trying to remove their tooth and it cracked in their mouth? It cracked the tooth next door in their mouth. And so all of these different nuances of, how they don't know, or how we don't even get these things taught in school, and then being able to train our team effectively in order to give these solutions to our patients. And quite honestly, with a lot of the dentists that I've consulted, it's being able to role play in your 4x4 meetings of how you're going to handle these types of situations so that you are prepared. Because guess what? Repetition is important. Repetition is how you can master some of these emotions when things arise that don't really go according to plan. But more importantly, in your own life, what are some of the fears that have held you back as a leader? Is it one of your team members that have been a cancer and is toxic, but she's been working for you for 20 years and you're so afraid to let her go because guess what? She does everything. She does everything in your practice. But who knows, she could be embezzling from you. You don't have a really keen sense of what she actually tells patients. Again, it's that fear. And if your chest is tightening up at this moment, where I've also felt this as well, then you know that you have to make a decision. So when are you going to let fear not control you and your decision making, but really just stick with the facts and make better decisions as a result? And then being able to train and teach your team members as a result as well. So letting go of fear in the practice. Now, when you decode some of these big fears, and I want you to make a list and maybe sit down with your office manager, with your team members, and if you are in partnership with another doctor, sit down with your partner, maybe it's your spouse, but decode some of these big fears, because you'll realize they're not really that big. And on the other side of that sheet, think about what is the worst thing that can happen. And for those of you, you have the guidebooks on the side so that you can actually see your answers as well. Now, the second thing that I really want to talk about is handling the negativity in the office. Now, handling the negativity in the office relates to the cancers that we can have in the office. And when I mean by cancers, the patients or the team members that we allow to stick on board. The ones that take advantage of us, the ones that cancel on us, the ones that we are so afraid to let go because it's going to take us so long to find a new team member that's great, that has all the experience. But at what cost? At what cost are you going to allow this to affect your practice? And so one of the things that I encourage you to do with your team is understanding why there is this negativity in the office. So perhaps in a team meeting, what are some of those, and we talk about the elephants in the room, some of the things that maybe perhaps people are afraid to bring up. Quite honestly, even in my own practice, we would do something that's called a 4x4 meeting every month. And we would block off 4 hours to talk about some of these things. And every single day at Huddle, we would celebrate our big wins, and we would celebrate even the ones, the things that we needed to learn from. And so there were the 3 big wins, and there was the one thing that we would showcase that perhaps it was a case that didn't go well, and that would dismiss some of this negativity that would happen in the office. And negativity happens in every single office. We are human. People might not have the best of days, but after this training module, you'll be able to have a better understanding of how to understand your team members better. And in the last module, I also had a couple of different personality tests there for your team so that you know when you're hiring them, you know how to find out what their appreciation style is like or their love language. And there are all sorts of different assessments. There's a DISC assessment, and we'll have some of that so that you can look at in the references. Forgiveness is huge. Forgiveness. This is a topic that, as doctors, as physicians, as healthcare professionals, we don't necessarily spend the time in focusing on. Okay? And forgiveness, what it allows you to do is understand where you are and understand some of the mistakes, some of the challenges that have happened, some of the bad decisions that you've made as a result. But this one point of forgiveness is being able to forgive yourself for some of the things that happen in your practice every single day. And some of the things that happen even in your own lives every single day. So if I can challenge you to think about what you are willing to let go of. And when I talk about forgiveness, I talk about it in 2 senses. Perhaps it's a patient that you need to forgive or let go of so that you can move on. Or maybe it's a team member, a colleague, a challenge that you encountered. When are you willing to let that go? And I encourage you this week to explore what forgiveness is and what that means in your practice.